Good morning, everyone. This is our lecture on correlation, which I flipped backwards in the syllabus. I do apologize. I think most of you were with me. We were just on the same thinking page, but here we are. And I'm not really in a mood to talk about correlation, but we're going to do it anyway. So we'll get started and I'll walk you through what I've done in the class. So right now, I guess I am worried if you are not collecting data. Please make sure your surveys are active. I've looked at all of them. I believe, or went in and started to edit and give you information about where you need to make final changes. But we need data. So really need to get that out there. Ask your friends, ask your family. I mean, get multiple people to post it on their social media and use their network. Yes, that's hopefully what we're doing. My original goal was 200 surveys completed for each group. So just be thinking about that as you're trying to get your data. So basically, we are gathering data right now, and you are hopefully sitting down and thinking about writing and how you're going to split up this paper with your group and how you're going to write it. In the meantime, we have just two more conceptual concepts to cover before class is really done and everything just turns to the project. So I have put up a few different things in here. There is the class lecture from 11-2. So if you did miss that, you can kind of go back and take a look. There is the intro to SPS video, which should have gotten you through the stats homework last week. And now I've done a video called Qualtrics to SPSS because I know I already have one group who is ready to take their data out of Qualtrics because they've met their 200 and they're ready to put that data into SPSS. So this video is really important. I'm probably going to be going over this in a live lecture class because not all the groups are there. But if you have your 200 surveys, you want to watch this Qualtrics to SPSS video because it's going to get you started on your data analysis. So for our part, the next lesson learning part is the correlation part of this seminar. So I finished out the PowerPoint on correlation, and I very much want to conceptually go over what correlation is. I'm hoping that many of you might remember some of the things we talked about again in 350, because if you do, this will make quite a difference. It should kind of, I don't want to say come back to haunt you, but certainly bring back some memories. So we talked about t-test, and now we're moving into correlation. What is a correlation? Well, I love my computer. Correlation assesses the relationships among variables. And typically we look at two variables, how two variables interact with each other, how X interacts with Y is what we would typically call it. And all of you know my smoking, cancer, what strength do they influence each other? So when we talk about correlation, the correlation coefficient is R. We also call that Pearson's R, and it's always a little case r. So Pearson's R is the correlation coefficient, and you'll see it referred to that. So two variables can have four different types of relationships with each other. So let's take self-disclosure and intimacy. If you were to think about that, how would you think that those two variables would go together? A lot of people would say the more self-disclosure you have, what happens to the intimacy level? The intimacy level goes up. So certainly, if that was the case, if as self-disclosure increased, intimacy also increased, that would be a positive relationship. Positive relationship. Now, there is actually a negative potential here for self-disclosure and intimacy. If I don't know someone very well upon meeting them and their self-disclosure goes through the roof, my intimacy towards them may actually go in the other direction. Like, this is just way too much. It's actually scaring me and turning me off in a way. So we're talking about when we say a negative relationship is one is going up, one variable is going up, and the other variables going down in the opposite direction. So they're still related, and actually too much self-disclosure can lead to less intimacy, especially when just getting to know someone for the first time. I often would tell when I teach relational, telling someone your whole life story in one night is not a good first date. Typically, that would actually scare people the other way, could have a very negative. Curvilinear relationships don't often happen, but they are interesting. And it's where initially the two variables influence each other in a positive direction, but then take a turn and have a negative relationship. We call that a curvilinear. And there are actually more variables than you might think of that do this. Teaching nonverbal, I would say your nonverbal skill set is one. So when you are young, you don't have a lot of nonverbals at all. You don't understand nonverbal communication. As you get older, you begin to gain more nonverbal communication control, and you peak in your nonverbal learning around 30, believe it or not, or 40. And then you start to lose nonverbal communication skills as you get older. So we say it's curvilinear. It's a perfect, curve. I used driving as a baby. You have no driving skills, right? This would be terrible. But as you get older, you learn to drive, and your driving ability continues to increase the more you drive. But at a certain point, as you age, what starts happening to your driving ability? Meow, goes in the opposite direction. So that is a curvilinear relationship. And then we have no relationship whatsoever. The two things just are not related in any way, shape, or form. So we'll take a look at what these look like. Positive correlation, both are increasing at the same time. So your level of communication, apprehension, and shyness, those could be positively correlated. If you are very, very high on the apprehension, you're probably going to be high on shyness as well. One of the things I found early on is that while my shy students were also incredibly communicatively apprehensive, they seemed to give the better speech. So their communication, high communication apprehension, was positively correlated with better grades on speeches. And this is kind of an interesting finding, because you would think that students who had less communication apprehension would get better grades, but they didn't. Because they weren't nervous about getting up and speaking, they didn't prepare or follow the guidelines. So typically they did worse. The ones with the super high communication apprehension were so freaked out that they prepared, they practiced, they listened to what I said, and they followed it, and tended to get better grades. There was a positive correlation. Here we have that negative correlation again, goes in different directions. So the one that I used in 350, if you remember, was from a funny guy. I thought he was funny, and it was about your happiness level. The more pictures you take of your girlfriend on vacation, the more pictures you take of her, the less happy you become, because you have to spend your whole time photographing her. And again, if I took 25 pictures up here, what's my happiness level? Boom. It's close to zero. I'm not happy. And if I'm happy out here, then look, I've only taken like 2 pictures. So you see how that works? This could be, again, self-disclosure really high. You're telling me everything about yourself. My intimacy is near zero. If you, and I do believe this, if you reveal just a little bit, to some degree, that's going to maybe increase that intimacy, make the person even more intrigued. And this is whether you own cats and the possibility of your house getting struck by lightning. There is no correlation between the two. The two things are not related. All right, so you are going to be running in your data a correlation matrix to see if you have any significant influences between variables, see if you have any positive, negative correlations. So we will be making a correlation matrix for this next assignment. And the way correlation matrices are made is here's one. Remember, the numbers going across the top represent the same variables going down the side. And people get a little crazy on this one because there's like, well, what happened to this score? Well, one variable cannot correlate with itself. It needs another variable. So when we look at this, the Pearson's R is always expressed as a number from 0.10 to negative 1.0. Those would be perfect correlations. 1.0 or negative 1.0 would be a perfect, strongest possible correlation. And that very rarely happens. So we look at this, and I remember I asked you in 350, what is the strongest positive correlation on here? You literally are just looking for the highest number, closest to either to positive 1.0. What is closest to 1.0? And it would be 0.96. That is the closest. This is the strongest positive correlation, and it is between executive function and working memory. Those two things highly influence each other. That is a really strong correlation. Positive. They both, the more working memory and the more function you have, they both increase at the same time. Now, if I asked you to find the strongest negative correlation, okay, things that go in the opposite direction, I'm looking for the number closest to negative 1.0. Of course, that number is negative 0.82. And this correlation is between age and processing speed. This makes sense. As age goes up, guess what goes down? Your processing speed. And that makes absolute sense. When you start looking at correlations, it should make sense if they're correlated or not. We've got a very weak correlation here at 0.08. Your vocabulary, the level of your vocabulary seems to have nothing to do with the processing speed of your um, of your brain and cognitive function. So even though I have a good vocabulary, it still doesn't change how I process. It's very weakly correlated, hardly at all. Okay, I threw up another correlation, a bigger one, just so you saw this again in 350. Remember, all the variables down here are the same as they are going across. One that stuck out to me is this point, whoop, I'm so sorry, negative 0.73, because that's a pretty strong correlation. And what was funny to me about that is it's Machiavellian leadership and transformational leadership. So, and it makes perfect sense. The more transformational you are, the less Machiavellian you are. They're complete opposites. They're supposed to be complete opposites. If I found this was a positive, I would have been freaking out and think, oh, there's something wrong with my data. That makes sense. And that's the interesting part. When you do get a negative correlation or a positive correlation you weren't expecting, your job is to then figure out why and explain it based on the research. Here's another one, this negative 4.0 here. It's not that strong, but it's still significant. It's a negative. The more autocratic or bureaucratic you are, guess what? The less collaborative or supportive you are. So that's how that works. So this is how we read this. This chart has asterisks in it, and it's going back to our confidence levels and probability levels. It's significant at the 95% level with 1 asterisk. 2 asterisks, this was a significant difference at the 0.09 level. So let's find one real quick here. You see this 0.17. This was between provost communication and personal religiosity. It's not a strong correlation. However, what we did find is pretty significant in terms of the fact that they were even related. That is significant. There is something there, albeit very weak. And that's kind of what that is denoting. If two variables are correlated too highly, we also kind of have to ask, did we measure the same variable? And just call it something else. And we call that multicollinearity. And that is bad. Multicollinearity occurs, again, if I had two variables that I said were different, and I used different scales to measure them, but they both correlated positively to be the exact same variable. I essentially didn't pick good measures, and I ended up with multicollinearity. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so that's just the conceptual, what is correlation, how two variables influence each other. All the variables in correlation, by the way, also must be interval level. You cannot correlate between nominal and ordinal variables. So we only look at correlation between interval level variables. So we're going to go ahead to our SPSS data set that I'm going to be giving you. Remember, here it is. You also can only run a correlation matrix based on summated variables. Okay, so we need these summated variables here to run our correlation matrix. So once you have all your summated variables, I'm looking at this one and wondering why that didn't sum very well, why it looks like I'm missing a lot of numbers on my CO sum. So I might have to go back and check that before I send you this data set. But at any rate, I'm going to come up to analyze, really easy, correlate, bivariate, always bivariate. I'm going to click that. As you can see, I've already got my 3 interval variables in there. I want a Pearson's. Remember, Pearson's are two-tailed. I'm going to click on options. This is perfect. I want means and standard deviations. I want to exclude cases pairwise, and I'm going to hit continue. And then I'm going to hit OK. And here is my correlation matrix. And notice AL sum, SL sum, CO sum, and it's the same across the top. Your homework is going to be to make the correlation matrix. Aren't I tricky? And you need to figure that out, which is going to be interesting for you to do. Now, let me tell you, you're looking for the 2 variables and the number that correlates with each other. There's really only 3 numbers on here. These are the 2 correlating with AL sum. So can you put together the 3 by 3 matrix? N always refers to the number of people that answered that question, which is why I'm looking at this over here going, why did so few people answer in comparison to the first 2? So I'll recheck that calculation, but this is the number of people who took it. This is the significance, okay? These are the correlations. Can you put these 3 correlations into a table so that they make sense? I think that you can. Remember, nothing can correlate with itself. So that's why you see ones there. You simply have to pick out the other numbers. There's only 3. So I think you can do it. Actually, there's more than 3, but I'm pretty sure you guys can figure this out in terms of putting this into a simple correlation matrix. So I will get the data set up for you. Remember, it is analyze, correlate, bivariate, your summated variables only, Pearson's R, hit OK. All right, that's the job before you today. I think that gets you a pretty good start on correlation and the concept of correlation. And we will be talking about our next concept the following Monday, which will actually be regression. And that's it. It'll be our last lecture of the semester.